The Strait of Hormuz, the world's most critical oil choke point, is now effectively closed. Shipping has plunged, insurance has vanished, and yet Washington insists the hard part is done. But the facts don't line up. If Iran's capabilities have been degraded, why is Hormuz still shut? If its missile force has been hit, why do experts admit we still don't know what's left? And if this war was about the nuclear file, why is the focus shifting toward Iran's energy infrastructure? Tonight, we cut through the contradictions. 100 days in oil. Oil forecasts are climbing, global supply is tightening, and the IMF warns of an inflation shock. From the Red Sea to Lebanon, the conflict is widening, while inside Iran, the system holds under pressure. So here's the bottom line. Can air power truly dismantle Iran's military capacity, or just buy time? And can it stop a nuclear comeback? We put those questions to our panel in All 24 News Special shortly. Hello there, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to tonight's special edition. And before we bring in our guests, from Isfahan to the Strait of Hormuz, tensions are spilling over militarily and economically, with both sides signaling further escalation. As Washington hints at decisive days ahead and Tehran ramps up its response, all eyes are now on the next 48 hours, seen as a critical window that could shape the course of this conflict. Here's Zahra Farjani.
The situation in Iran is escalating fast, with new strikes, casualties, and growing threats targeting strategic infrastructure and global interests. Iran's Revolutionary Guard says a senior military advisor, Jamshid Eshaki, was killed in a U.S. Zionist strike on Isfahan, while in Zanjan, at least 4 people were killed and 26 injured after a building was hit. The Iranian army also says it shot down 2 MQ-9 drones over Isfahan, where explosions and fires were reported. Meanwhile, Iranian media say a strike targets the desalination plant on Kashm Island in the Strait of Hormuz, putting it out of service. Iran is now escalating its response. The Revolutionary Guard warns it will begin targeting U.S. tech, communications, and AI companies in the region starting April 1st. On the ground, Iran also claims it has launched new missile and drone attacks on Zionist-linked sites and a U.S. command facility in the region. On the diplomatic front, Tehran is rejecting a claimed U.S. truce proposal.
The materials include very excessive, unrealistic, and unreasonable demands. Our stance has been clear. We have no direct negotiation with the United States.
In Washington, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth says the coming days will be decisive. Hegseth says U.S. strikes are weakening Iran's military, adding that Washington still has more options.
The upcoming days will be decisive. Iran knows that. And there's almost nothing they can militarily do about it. Yes, they will still shoot some missiles, but we will shoot them down. Of note, the last 24 hours saw the lowest number of enemy missiles and drones fired by Iran.
President Donald Trump, meanwhile, says he's open to ending the campaign, even with the Strait of Hormuz still closed, but is urging allies to step up.
All of those countries that can't get jet fuel because of the Strait of Hormuz, like the United Kingdom, which refuse to get involved in the decapitation of Iran, I have a suggestion for you. Number 1, buy from the US, we have plenty. And number 2, build up some delayed courage. Go to the Strait and just take it.
As the conflict intensifies, attention is now turning to the next 48 hours, widely seen as a decisive window that could shape the trajectory of the war across the Middle East.
All right, let's bring in our experts for tonight. I have with me here in the studio Dr. Abdul Toumi, geopolitical analyst and mini affairs expert, tracking the developments, Gulf alliances, and the regional chessboard. Thank you indeed, Professor, for agreeing to be with us tonight.
Good evening, and thank you for having me on the program.
Thank you indeed. And from Glasgow, I am honored to welcome Dr. Yvonne Ridley, British journalist and author and Middle East commentator, also a Scottish Parliament for the Workers' Party candidate. Thank you indeed for agreeing to be with us, ma'am.
Thank you, my pleasure.
And from Philadelphia is Dr. Hussein Fatni, Professor of Law and Society at the University of Pennsylvania, bringing a legal lens to the escalation, civilian infrastructure, and the rules of war. Thank you, Professor, for agreeing to be with us tonight.
Thank you, Mr. Zakaria, for the invitation.
Thank you indeed. And from Tehran is Mr. Yusuf Jalali, Middle East journalist and analyst based in Tehran, and also an expert in Middle East affairs. Thank you, sir, for agreeing to be with us at this very late hour for you.
Thanks for having me.
And of course, last but not least, is Mohammed Krissassi. He is an expert in financial affairs and also a geopolitical observer. Thank you indeed, Mr. Mohammed Krissassi, for agreeing to be with us.
Always a pleasure to be with you and your honorable guest.
Thank you indeed. And let me start with this broad question. Perhaps when we speak about the most immediate reports, Brookings and CFR both say the Strait is effectively or functionally closed, very little traffic, a major shock to energy flows. But the White House has been ambiguous about whether reopening it is actually a core U.S. objective. Recent WSJ reporting suggests it's not being treated as non-negotiable goal. So the question might go as, what exactly is the U.S. strategy here? Forcing the Strait open or just containing the damage while hoping Iran blinks, let's say? Dr. Abdul Toumi.
Actually, as the war enters its second month, and there are many developments have been going on during the last 5 weeks, starting from the beginning of this illegal and unjust war and this aggression from the US and the Zionist entity on Iran, and the Zionist entity Prime Minister and the US President did shape or sold a narrative of regime change and therefore capitulation. So, and meanwhile, the development of this war, so these two goals didn't achieve. So there was another trajectory of that, the course of that war, of this war, is about the going after or weaken the regime as they portrayed it. So, and this didn't work either. And one has to remember, in the pretext of this war was to go and, quote unquote, free the Iranian people. Whereas the ongoing dynamic of this war was waging war against the Iranian. And you use an interesting word in your introductory of, or in your opening statement of the contradiction. So it's a part of the art of contradiction. So this war is from day one, it's illegal. And strategically speaking, from the other side, who didn't have a strategic end game of this war, and because as a result of their arrogance of misunderstanding of the Iranian people on one hand, and also to the misunderstanding of the entire political culture of the region. Having said that, they did, actually, the Americans, for instance, and even the Zionists entity, they did deal with this in the last 2 decades or so, in the rush of the invasion of Iraq in 2003, and all that consequences and catastrophic consequences that spread over the region. So it looks like those arrogants, they don't want to understand the culture and also the dynamic of change on one hand, and the volatility of the geography and the demography, and to push further to the geopolitics element. So here and then, within which led from this no end game and no objective strategy for this, didn't have clear objectives. So they led now to the crisis of world energy. And now I'm speaking about the Strait of Hormuz, but one has to look with, carefully to this could be a tactic or maneuver tactic by like kind of deviation for the focus on the Hormuz Strait to Bab el-Mandeb, because now these two straits are the lungs of the world economy, and we see now the consequences of this war, how it's impacting a great deal the Asian countries and Americans and the Europeans as well. And this is why now has to look for the next hours attentively and all about this dynamic, this movement or these mobilities, militarily, economically, and also diplomatically, because there is this, the latest development on this mediation of the quartet of the regional leaders in like Turkey, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt, who are playing a major role. And there is another element. This is why this war is expanding globally, and we saw how now China has positioned itself on the posture of the development, how this will break through.
Thank you indeed. And now let's move on to Mr. Mohammed Krissasi to give us an economic point of view when it comes to the reports that we have read this week by AP, that some experts are floating the idea of seizing Hog Island, Iran's main oil export terminal, as a way perhaps to force Tehran's hand. But AP also noted that option is seen as extremely risky for US troops and not a guaranteed path to surrender. Is that the kind of escalation we're moving toward, or is the administration more likely to stick with a blockade? And according to you, Mr. Mohammed Krissasi, how would the Gulf states react to this?
Well, first of all, if they want to go to this seizing of Hog Island, it's actually very, very dangerous. It's a major escalation, not only for the American, but all for the Gulf region, specifically also for the GCC. Hog Island handles about 80 to 90% of Iran oil export, so taking it will immediately cripple Iran's main revenue source, send a shock wave through global oil market, and it will be seen by Iran as a direct attack on the core economic sovereignty. Why is it considered, to answer the question, extremely risky? Number one, it requires an invasion occupation. Iran will likely respond with a missile barrage, small boat attacks, and meaning as they did before nearby water. So US force will be highly exposed in the Gulf, and most importantly, it does not guarantee the surrender of Iran. Iran could still escalate regionally, attack the shipping, and use proxies. The bottom line is a war-winning gamble more than a pressure tactic. The blockade already with the Detroit of Hormuz puts some pressure, and this is much consistent with what you are seeing now. Instead of occupying territory, the US and allies should look more for the negotiation than playing this war game with no hand and very, very, very big causality for the region.
Thank you indeed. And Mr. Jalali, from your vantage point in Tehran, could you please help us understand what the strikes have actually achieved? CSIS says Iranian missile launches have dropped sharply, but Brookings says the key unknown is how many launchers and missiles remain. what they call the denominator between two inverted commas. Now, this inside Iran, is the military feeling the pressure, or are they confident they've retained enough to keep the strait closed and the war ongoing?
Well, the Iranians seem to be very much confident that they can continue this fight and continue to resist against the incoming strikes from the United States and Israel. Of course, we hear and listen to the comments coming from different Iranian officials, including Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, the Speaker of Iran's parliament himself. He said that the Iranians are very much ready and are awaiting the arrival of the American soldiers to set foot on the Iranian islands and for Iran to set them on fire. And he is also warning the regional countries that directly or indirectly are involved in helping or assisting the United States to launch its attacks against Iran. Ghalibaf said and warned those countries that they would be punished too, along with the Americans. So the rhetoric is very much about defiance and resilience and resistance against the what Iran calls a war of choice imposed against the Islamic Republic, because Iran is saying that it was engaged in talks with the US, and then the United States betrayed diplomacy. It attacked Iran while Iran was waiting for the fourth round of nuclear talks with the United States. But at the same time, Iran is saying that it is ready for weeks and even months of the continuation of this conflict. And Iran is not showing any willingness to engage in talks right now, because Iran does not trust the United States and does not trust Trump in particular. And it is rejecting any prospect of talks with the US. This comes despite claims by Donald Trump himself, who said that the Iranians are begging for talks and for negotiations. But we have been hearing comments coming from Mr. Abbas Araghchi, the Iranian foreign minister, who said that there have been some exchange of messages through third parties, but direct talks or formal negotiations have never taken place since the start of this conflict. So this rhetoric shows that Iran sees in itself the capability to continue this war, to continue to resist the strikes, and to continue to inflict damages upon the American and Israeli interests through what it calls asymmetric warfare, by targeting American assets in the GCC countries and by choking the strategic Strait of Hormuz, which has already shown how it can lead to some repercussions and ripple effects globally, targeting and, of course, creating some problems and troubles for the oil economy, for the passage of vessels from this strategic choke point, because Iran is now saying that it is ready to continue to pressure the Strait of Hormuz, and it is only allowing the passage of friendly vessels from this strategic strait, vessels coming from China or headed towards China, India, Pakistan, and Russia. So those vessels are considered friendly vessels coming from friendly countries, and Iran is allowing those ships to pass through the strategic strait. But Iran is also looking at this Strait of Hormuz as a leverage, not just militarily right now, but economically. Iranians are now saying that in the day after this war, they will continue to impose tariffs or impose tolls on the passing ships in order to create some leverage or bargaining chip against the economic sanctions the United States and the Western Hemisphere has imposed against Iran. So the Iranians are saying that this would act as a counterpoint or counterforce to those sanctions by the United States. And we have just heard that the Iranian Parliament, National Security Commission, lawmakers there have approved this bill to enforce this new regime upon this Strait of Hormuz, to try to start imposing fees, transit fees or tolls on the passing ships, And this is very much significant because we see that Donald Trump has shifted his focus and primary goals from regime change to reopening the Strait of Hormuz. And he has been reaching out to the European countries to try to engage them and involve them in trying to reopen the Strait of Hormuz and resume the operation there. But of course, we have seen some major gap or divergence between the United States and the European nations. They're reluctant to engage themselves in any kind of hostility with the Iranians. They're refusing and rejecting Trump's demands to engage and take part or just involve their forces in this process of reopening the Strait of Hormuz. So all in all, Iran has been projecting power, has been projecting defiance against the Americans, and is saying that it is ready to continue this war.
Thank you indeed. And now we move to another critical point, perhaps the nuclear dimension, which is even murkier. Recent reporting says facilities have been hit and pressure is really high, but Iran still appears to retain some enriched uranium stockpile. The IISS warns that this war has major implications for the non-proliferation regime, but it's not a clean final solution. So I'll ask the question, perhaps the administration, the US administration doesn't want to answer. Can airstrikes actually stop Iran from ever rebuilding a nuclear capability, or are we just buying time, and at what cost, Dr. Abdunor Toumi?
Actually, this was the part of this second phase of this war. And do you remember the main objective was to go after the nuclear facilities and the ballistic missiles and all the nuclear program. But all these now are sided or are put on side. So the US administration now is in this blurry corridor or in this confusion part because all its objectives doesn't match with the main objective is going after the destruction and of the nuclear program and weaken Iran and pushing for the fall of the regime, therefore creating a political vacuum and a security vacuum in which will lead to anarchy and instability in Iran. So and now after 5 weeks of massive bombing and this actually move from this war, it's already, it's illegal, and going after now industrial facilities and going to some even civilian facilities. But back to your question about the nuclear program and how this is impacting, actually it's very interesting development here because the Iranians who have been showing their will and cooperating with the atomic agencies and leaving inspectors to go and having even struck a deal with the Obama administration in 2015 and with the US administration, the Europeans and China and Russia. And this administration, his first term, he did withdraw from that deal and again started a process of negotiation about the nuclear program twice, and he betrayed the Iranians twice in the middle of discussions about this to find a breakthrough and have this possibility to create a sense of peace and stability in the region. But now the Iranians are going nuclear because they don't trust anymore the Americans and the Westerners at large. So, but what is interesting, it's not only now about only Iran, it's other countries, pivotal countries in the region who are or will go nuclear. Like, for instance, Turkey is developing its nuclear program. Pakistan, it's already in a nuclear power, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and other countries. So all these parameters are actually it's like kind of slapping the U.S., particularly this administration, I mean, who doesn't have a clue about the region nor the ramifications of its geopolitics and economics. And this is why now, as your guest from Tehran, who did mention actually 2 or 3 keywords about resistance, resilience, and defense. And it's a part of the Iranian soldier of the people in the region. And this is why now is making the US administration in the panic mode, because they were not expecting this retaliation or moral and cultural retaliation besides the military retaliation vis-a-vis to this aggression. So this is, again, we are in this moment which this war has shifted, because it started with Zionist identity prime minister, because he's the one who started this war. And now he handed it to the US president to deal with it. But both of them now are in this panic situation, and they don't know how to at least look or find for an exit strategy, because they didn't have a strategy to begin with.
Mm-hmm. Thank you indeed. And now I move on to you, Dr. Ivan Ridley. You have covered the region long enough to know that regimes often survive precisely when they are supposed to collapse. Brookings says the system is still holding together. And Reuters reports Tehran has intensified its crackdown on dissent, endurance, and repression, not collapse. So, is the war weakening the Islamic Republic, or handing it the perfect excuse to crush opposition and rally nationalist sentiment, at least according to the views of the Western media?
Well, I think that we can see that the Iranian people are rallying around the government. Nobody wants to see their own country being bombed, and the resilience and endurance of the Iranian people is quite remarkable. But you have to remember that these people have been suffering for years under crippling sanctions imposed by the US. But while the Iranian government is making the most of a terrible situation, I think that what is crumbling and falling apart is the alliance between Britain and America, the much talked about but rarely seen special relationship. In fact, just a few hours ago, Donald Trump lashed out at Britain, saying that America won't be there to help you anymore, just like you weren't there for us. And this has really inflamed a lot of anger in Britain. It was an extraordinary rant against his allies over the Iran war, and not just Britain got the full Trump rant. He told other countries that if they didn't take part in the strikes against Iran, they'll have to go get your own oil, and saying that they should attempt to reopen the Strait of Hormuz themselves, now that the US had done the hard part. And again, it reignited the row because he said that Britain had refused to get involved in the decapitation of Iran. Well, Britain and the rest of Europe have refused to follow in Trump's footsteps because they are not convinced by this war in Iran. It came from nowhere without warning. There was no plan. There's certainly no plan B or C. And now the whole world is engulfed in this price war over fuel and oil. And at least 11 countries, Jordan, Bahrain, Turkey, Bolivia, Colombia, Honduras, Chile, Belize, South Africa, Chad, and Brazil, have recalled their ambassadors to Israel or have severed ties altogether. So what is fragmenting and what is breaking up are strategic alliances and friendships that America once had. And of course, America's biggest supporter is Israel, which has no friends bar America. So these two countries are becoming increasingly isolated, and there are very few allies and partners left apart from Azerbaijan and those countries that signed up to the Abraham Accords in the Arab world, like the UAE and Bahrain. Italy has blocked American military aircraft from landing in the country, saying we're not part of your war. And of course, that made Italy become the first NATO member to close its airports to the United States. And more former allies of America have also blocked military flights as the Iran war really rips open this rift between Trump and Europe. And the Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth, he has attacked the British Royal Navy while Trump told the other parts of Europe to build up some delayed courage and secure the Strait of Hormuz for themselves. Operation Epic Fury is obviously well named, but because it is causing fury among all of America's traditional allies. And it's certainly, I mean, the Iranians must be sitting back and laughing at all of this chaos that is unfolding, because it is exposing all the weaknesses and pressures that Europe and the wider world are facing. And, you know, I'm looking at, in particular, at the Arab countries, and the leaders there are looking incredibly weak. And so, and it makes it more poignant, and that the passing of a great man like Liamin Zeroual really just serves to highlight how weak the Arab rulers are, who are so addicted to power they can't walk away. So if I can take this opportunity just to pass on my respects to the Algerian people, to lose such a giant, the Lion of Batna, you know, it's we are so lacking in leaders like him, not just in Europe, but in the Arab world as well.
Thank you indeed, Professor Yvonne Ridley. And now I move on to you, Dr. Fatni. From a legal perspective, rather, the war has already ceased to be bilateral, let's say. CSIS says Iran widened the conflict across multiple countries very early on. And we have the Chatham House saying Houthi involvement in the Red Sea is a serious escalation that threatens global trade. Now, the Zionist entity has also expanded operations in Lebanon, causing mass displacement. When a conflict perhaps gets bigger like this, does international law have any mechanism to contain it, or are we watching a regional war unfold without any legal guardians, let's say?
First of all, let me just pass my regards to my colleagues and to your respected audience. Everyone at this stage knows that the war declared on Iran is illegal. Because when we look at the United Nations Charter, when we look at the preamble, which is the introduction of the United Nations Charter, it makes it very clear that any dispute between nations has to be settled in a peaceful way. And there is an emphasis on that. There is no question that this dispute with Iran can be settled through peaceful means. And there is really no need for the use of force. It's in that context that in international law, there was so much emphasis on the use of force as a last resort. And in international law, as we all know, those of us, even those who are not really familiar with international law, know that force can be used only in terms of self-defense and also in terms of collective security and humanitarian intervention. And even when force is used, there are limitations to its use. It has to be used according to humanitarian law. And when we really talk about humanitarian law, we're really talking about what we refer to as the laws of war. And the laws of war are manifested in the Fourth Geneva Convention, which were adopted in 1949. And the one that is so significant, it's the last Fourth Geneva Convention, which has to deal with the protection of civilians. And this is really the convention that is implicated here. Now, if we really have to go and talk about the guardrails and the consequences of this war that you mentioned is spilling over, there is no question that this war has spilled over. It's in that context that from the beginning, there was a sense and there was really an attempt to avoid being engaged in this war. Now, we know that this war, we have the Gulf countries involved. Now we have the Houthis and other actors as well. Everyone recognized the bravery of the Houthis. As a matter of fact, Trump himself recognized the bravery of the Houthis because he was entangled with them in 2025, and he ended up basically signing an agreement with them. So when we really talk about getting the Houthis involved in this war, and talking about also Israel involved in Lebanon, talking about whether there is more of an international law that addresses the issue, yes, there is. Because now what kind of international law is implicated, we're really talking really more about humanitarian law. And humanitarian law, we're talking more about the laws of war. These are the laws, especially, as I mentioned, the Fourth Geneva Convention that deals with the protection of civilians. And the consequences will be very dire, especially for the United States. Because when we really talk about the United States, we talk about a country that is supposed to promote the rule of law. It is a country that's supposed to basically emphasize the human dignity, the protection of the individual. And if the United States end up basically committing this violation, then you ask yourself, who else really should really pay attention to the respect and the protection of the rights of the individual globally? One thing that we have to really pay attention is, in terms of international relation, international law, also there is an issue of perception too. And when the US is engaged in such a war that has violated these individual rights, when we see the killing of 150 schoolgirls, That is really horrible. As a matter of fact, it is very horrible for the American people to know that 150 schoolgirls have been killed by an American missile, because they really envision what happened if that missile fell on an American school and 150 American schoolgirls died as a result of that. This is really a horrible thing for Americans to envision. It's in that context when you really think about the way the American people think about this war. The polls show that one poll after another, they are against this war. So in terms of really talking about girls, the way the American people think about this war, and whether we have guards that protect in terms of international law that can be implemented, well, we're really talking about humanitarian law. And I really don't think that whether the US or Israel or any other country is really going to get away for the violations of this humanitarian law. And these are really the most significant consequences that the US and Israel or any country in that context would really be able to get away with it.
Well, it seems that the Zionist entity did get away with murder when it conducted that genocide in Gaza. But nevertheless, just humor me, Professor. Let me just get the overall mood inside Iran from Mr. Jalali.
I don't think,
yeah?
May I say, I don't think really getting away with it, you know. As if you really think about it, Israel today is very isolated. When you really even look at the United States, if you really look at polls, Israel is so isolated in the United States. It used to have the support of the American people, whether they are Democrats, Republicans, one poll after another. They don't even used to hear of the Palestinians. Today, if you really look at the polls, that Israel, the Israeli government is so down in the polls. AIPAC, which is one of the lobbyist group that supports Israel. Now, many people running for office in Congress now are trying to distance themselves from AIPAC because it's becoming more of a liability. And this is really, we can really think of that. This is really a consequences of the war, not just of this war, but the consequences really of what's really happening in Gaza. Suddenly the average person now knows about Gaza. It used to be no one really cared about the Palestinian. The word Palestinian was not even mentioned in the United States. No one really knows anything about Gaza. And now it is really very surprising that you lost that support. It's going to take years and years and years and years for the Israeli to repair that image they have in the United States. And I'm not saying that, believe me. They are saying that. They are now trying to work on how they go about repairing that image.
Thank you indeed. Mr. Jalali, what is the mood inside Iran? I mean, we have seen this supposedly military operation between two inverted commas, as the United States would like to call it, or as Trump would like to call it. They were perhaps after certain set objectives, but these objectives turned out to be not exactly the objectives that they are after. Now, perhaps one of them was regime change, which they denied. According to you, are there signs of any major defections among the leadership there in Iran? I mean, if we come to read reports such as Brookings, they are saying that there have been none, which argues against imminent collapse whatsoever. But what about the streets there? Are Iranians blaming the regime for the war or uniting behind it?
Well, there seems to be a sign of rallying around the flag here in Iran. We can see that different people from different walks of life have been staging these rallies, nightly rallies, of course, across the capital, Tehran, and across the country. You could see people waving flags, taking part in large numbers in rallies in support of the government. These are the supporters of the Islamic Republic. Iran is home to 90 million people, and 90 million people with 90 million different views. But if you take a look at the streets, what is happening on the streets, you can see significant support for the Islamic Republic coming from ordinary citizens. And if you remember, following the protests that erupted over economic grievances in December last year, which stretched into January this year, those protests subsided. And of course, there have been some protests being held outside of Iran in different countries around the world in support of the protests domestically. And those protests outside of Iran's borders have also subsided because people are not willing to see Iran being bombed by the United States. People are starting to rally around the flag. They're throwing their weight behind the Islamic Republic. And people here have been expressing their support for the new supreme leader, Ayatollah Moshtaba Khamenei, the son of the late Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. So you could see this sense of survival and there's this sense of unity, national unity. And the Iranian state broadcaster has also been trying to promote this sense of national bond and national unity, advising people to just set aside differences, focus on resistance right now to win this war against the United States. Then the Iranian government promised that it would deal with the economic grievances of the people. People here in Iran continue to struggle under economic hardship, partly due to the sanctions imposed by the United States against Iran, but also because of some mismanagement by the Iranian government. But of course, all in all, you can see this national unity taking shape and unfolding here in Iran across the political spectrum. You can see different politicians coming from different political backgrounds are starting to throw their weight behind the Islamic Republic. You can see some people, ordinary citizens, just joining this national wave of expression of support for the Islamic Republic. And this is very much needed because the Iranian officials have been welcoming these rallies, nightly rallies. People stay out on the streets throughout the night until the morning prayers. And this is very much significant and welcomed by the Iranian government. You can see different Iranian officials, including Parliament Speaker Mr. Ghalibaf, these people have been advising people to stay on the streets because they believe that the streets is now a new front, a civilian front, if you will, against the United States. Because in the US, you can see Donald Trump keeps talking about regime change, and keeps talking about the Iranian political system lacking popular support. And now this turnout by the people on the streets is a message to Trump himself and to the entire world that the Islamic Republic continues to enjoy significant public support here in Iran. And of course, people here are really mocking what Trump is talking about. He says that the regime change has happened, but people here say the Islamic Republic continues to survive this war. And they're saying that basically Donald Trump has changed the definition of regime change in order to just convince his other politicians in the United States or people in the Congress or people across the political spectrum in the United States that his primary goal of regime change has indeed taken place. But in fact, it did not take place. He just changed the definition of regime change. He's talking about the fact that he took out the supreme leader in Iran, and he thought that by assassinating the supreme leader, then a regime change would take place immediately. But it did not happen because Iran's political structure is very much resilient against any blows like this. Iran says that it has a decentralized power structure, not focused specifically and not reliant specifically on a single person, even if that person is a supreme leader. The highest ranking politician in Iran was assassinated and nothing happened. They quickly changed different leaders in Iran. The high command structure, the high leadership, the top leaders of Iran's military were also assassinated, and Iran quickly replaced them by new ones. And Iran is saying that it is even ready and prepared to absorb even stronger strikes and blows from the United States, from the Israelis, and to survive those pressures from those countries. So all in all, you could see this sense of resilience being projected both by the Iranian people and by the Iranian officials.
Mm-hmm. And while Iran keep resilient, we still feel the global impact, economically speaking. There is an economic shock from oil prices all the way to inflation. But now, Mr. Mohammed Krissasi, the numbers are starting to look like a global crisis, not just a regional one. And Reuters says Brent forecasts have been sharply raised. One poll lifted the 2026 forecast to $82.85, with warnings of much higher if Hormuz stays shut. OPEC as well output has plunged. The IMF warns the conflict could slow growth and raise prices globally. In the US, fuel prices are already above $4 a gallon. How much longer can the administration sustain this war before the economic pain at home forces a political reckoning? Mohammed Krissasi, did you hear my question?
Yes, I did indeed, Karim, and you are really describing the classic pressure point where geopolitics collides with the domestic economics. And historically, that's where conflict become hardest to sustain. A few key dynamics are converging. You have the energy markets at the transmission mechanism. When you mention, as you did, the Brent forecast rising and the risk tied to the Strait of Hormuz, of course, that's critical. Roughly, as we mentioned by all my predecessor, a fifth of the global oil passes through that corridor. Any prolonged disruption there does not just nudge price, it can structurally reset them higher. And that's why, as you said, the forecast is jumping from the $80 to today, I think it was close at 112. And you talk about the organization like the OPEC. Well, they are cutting or losing output that amplify that effect. When you take the lower supply and you add the geopolitical risk premium, then it systems the high price and is not just a temporary spike. It's going to go further and further. Then it comes, of course, the causality is the domestic pain, and it shows up fast and visibly in like any macro indicator that you just named. The gasoline price are politically immediate. When US consumer today, they see that the gallon is at $4 at the pump, it feeds directly into this perception of economic mismanagement. Even if the root cause is global, the ripple effect into the transportation of the food cost, it ripple effect in the inflation expectation, and of course, the consumer sentiment at the kitchen table. This hit very, very hard, and this is why now we look at the global feedback and the warning from the institution, like you said, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. They are not abstract. The slower global growth and you add the higher energy costs, create a feedback loops. The demand weaken, the supply remain constrained, and the central bank of all of them face tougher trade-off. And then that's the combination that can tip economies toward stagnation and life condition. I don't want to go in the details of the economics, I think to get the image, but political timelines against economical timelines, the administration can usually sustain the foreign conflict, but not for that longer. You know, I think again and again is not sustainable for long. Maybe you are going to have a short-term spike between 1 and 3 months. This politically more or less survival. But when you have a medium term for 3 to 9 months, then the rising pressure, the narrative shifts, and then could become with the long term between 19 and 18 months, then the high risk of policy reverse of the de-escalation push. Again and again, the bottom line to conclude is the constraint is not just military or diplomatic, it's economic tolerance. And energy price are the fastest way to test that limit. They say if they stay high long enough, the political recalibration become the more likely than not. And as you said, the US, the midterm, as I said before, is always, the president knows always this majority. And I think this is what will happen. But also not on a more political things. I think with all this chaotic situation, is not only now political, it's become the global economy, and then the tolerance is not going to be in the duration. No, we have to act quickly, because we are going to be, again, like you said previously, chaotic, and then it can be very, very serious. As Dr. Fitney was saying, now you have manifestation in the States. Not only, again, the war, and we find out that it was not, they are saying we are doing a war by proxy.
So it seems
for
like the public
Israeli.
opinion is shifting toward enough is enough, let's say. Let me just get back to a diplomatic point here, and the paradox is to you, Dr. Abdunnoor Toumi. We have reports from Reuters saying that several Gulf states are telling Washington that ending the war is not enough, and they want Iran's missile and drone power reduced in a durable way. Yet Chatham House also says that the war is exacting a heavy toll on Gulf oil and gas exporters. So the question goes like this: what do Gulf capitals actually want? A ceasefire or a permanent degradation, let's say, of Iran's capabilities? And are they willing to pay for it, to pay for this war?
It's a very interesting development, because if this is true, it's very dangerous for the Gulf countries and also for the entire region. And as far as the Gulf country is concerned, it seems like they didn't get it, because this is not new. I mean, the Gulf countries have been going through wars in the last 4 decades, since the first war in the Gulf. It was in 1980 to 88, and it was a very, very bloody war between Iran and Iraq, and then led to the invasion of Saddam Hussein, late Iraqi leader of Kuwait, in 1990, and then led to the third Gulf War of the illegal invasion of the U.S. Against the regime of Saddam Hussein. So, and to this war, but the Gulf countries now have to review their strategy. They have to think strategically, and also they have to understand well what is going on, because they have been trusting the U.S. for 7 decades or so, but the result is zero today, knowing that you cannot put aside Iran. Iran is a part of the geography, the culture, the demography, and geopolitics, geoeconomics. So it is a part of it's a core of that part of the region. So this is, it has to be on bilateral level, like, for instance, Sultanate Oman, who has excellent relations with Iran and who has been dealing with Iran closely, to the point where the Iranians, actually the only country in the region that the Iranians trust is the Sultanate of Oman. So, but it's still in use. Western outlet media who have been reporting about this, but it was actually an interesting development it's happening on the Saudi position, who have been are trying to move slowly from the U.S. influence and heading east. And here, speaking about Saudi Arabia, one has to remember how the Saudis did trust the Chinese in their the China mediation to bring the Iranians and the Saudis, and that was blocked by the Chinese. So all this, it is, again, it's in regional politics, but has an impact on global politics because of the power and the strength and the influence of those countries in politics, in international politics. And this is why now one heard this report that the Gulf countries are still actually in that blurry line about what is going on in this war, so, and in which they were affected directly, and they were actually they were impacted directly, actually, in terms of their national security now is in question, and also their economic developments. Now in that the region, the Gulf countries who have been enjoying stability, security, stability and prosperity. So now all these three elements are in question as a result of the foreign actors who have been involving and interfering in the interactions, politics, and particularly when it comes to Iran. So, and again, to sum up all this, so Iran, it's a part of the region, as I said, culturally, politically, economically, and geostrategically as well. And so with Iran, is stable Iran, is the region will be, the entire region will be stabilized.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of the region, Dr. Abdel-Noor Toumi, this leads me to the next question to Dr. Yvonne. Yvonne Ridley, let's talk about the Red Sea. The Chatham House says the Bab el-Mandeb is a critical route, and Houthi attacks are seriously threatening trade and energy flows there. So the Houthis are not Iran, but they're, let's say, effectively acting as Tehran's long arm. How does a journalist report on a war that has these multiple interconnected fronts? And how do you avoid becoming a mouthpiece for whichever side is claiming victory? Dr. Yvonne Ridley, did you hear my question?
Yes, I did. Mm-hmm. It is an incredibly difficult war to cover for journalists because we simply aren't being told the truth. We've got a president in the United States who is or who has a long distance relationship with the truth. We certainly do not get the truth from Israel. It basically lies to the media, and of course a lot of the other areas aren't accessible to journalists. But the Bab al-Mandeb, which it literally means the Gulf of Tears, and my goodness, is it aptly named, has always been this sort of fragile passage between two continents. And today it is at the very center of this escalating conflict that is now reaching far beyond the Middle East. And roughly about 12% of all trade passes through this incredibly narrow strait every year, but it's worth about $1 trillion in terms of trade and goods. And of course, it has now been threatened by the Houthis, who have aligned themselves with Iran and have declared war on America. And of course, the Houthis have already proven that they know how to strike ships and warships, and it's something that they have been doing with an alarming degree of success. And just today, the Americans announced that they were sending a third aircraft carrier into the region, the George W. Bush aircraft carrier, which I think will no doubt become a strategic floating target for the Houthis. This war is escalating out of control. Donald Trump declared mission accomplished almost within hours of the first day. The man is clearly a fool. He doesn't have a plan. He doesn't have an exit strategy. He's falling out with strategic allies, and it is affecting everybody around the world, from world leaders right down to the ordinary van driver who wants to fill up his vehicle with fuel and try and make a living. Everyone is being affected by this disastrous war, and of course the world in the 21st century has always run on predictable issues like sea lanes. Now, once those sea lanes have become in disarray, globalization itself begins to unravel, and that is what we're seeing. The whole world is unraveling in all sorts of ways, and many of us, myself included, are predicting that this will spell the end of Israel. The Zionist state is lashing out in all directions, and of course we've seen the devastating images coming out of coming out of Lebanon, because they're now using the tactics that they used in Gaza to destroy Lebanon. And it's really shocking, and it brings us right back to the beginning of this program, when the panel was saying, where is international law? Who is the guardian of the world? And it really, we are in literally dire straits.
Thank you indeed, Dr. Yvonne Ridley. And now let me move on to our guest from Tehran, Mr. Jalali. Mr. Jalali, this is no longer something framed as a limited operation, as the United States would like to name it, or from the very beginning of this war. Mr. Jalali, recently we have heard that this conflict is a battle of endurance indeed, where time, geography, and resilience matter as much as air power. Now, from inside Tehran, does that feel really accurate? Is the regime preparing for a long war? And what does that look like for ordinary Iranians there?
Indeed, it is a game of endurance. And of course, the Islamic Republic is ready to outlast the United States and even Israel in this conflict, because they're talking about their capability in the missile launches and in drone launches towards the United States, towards the United States assets and interests in the region, and of course towards the Israeli territories. And this comes despite claims by Pete Hegseth, for example, from the United States, saying that they have been able to degrade Iran's ballistic missile capability, and of course drone production lines being destroyed and targeted during the airstrikes. But of course, we just heard a couple of days ago from a senior IRGC commander saying and claiming that Iran still has 70% of its missile arsenal still untapped in this conflict. And it has so far only used 30% of its missile at its disposal. So this means that Iran has the capability to continue this war for the upcoming weeks and even months. And of course, Iran has engaged itself in an asymmetric warfare aimed at imposing maximum damage and making it costly for the United States to engage itself in a long war with Iran. So the Iranians are projecting power. They're saying that they have the willingness, even not just the capability, but the willingness to continue this war, because they believe that this war is an existential war, and they say that we need to end this quote unquote vicious cycle of war, ceasefire, war. Then they believe that if they give in to a ceasefire, a temporary ceasefire, without achieving their goals, then the United States would attack them, or the Israelis would attack them again. The same thing that happened back in June. In June last year, the Iranians accepted a ceasefire verbally, without any agreement, without any deal to be signed by both sides of this war, of that war. And then the United States attacked Iran again while talks were underway, while diplomacy was up and running. Iranians were faced with the incoming strikes from the Americans and the Israelis. So they see this war now as an opportunity, or a blessing in disguise, as they describe it, to end this cycle of war, ceasefire war. And they believe that they have the military capability at the same time. They're saying that they continue to launch drones, they continue to launch missiles towards Israeli territories, and they continue to target the American assets in the region. And they're saying that they have this popularity and public support because we have not seen any indication of protests as hoped by the United States, as hoped by the Israeli officials. They've been calling on Iranians to just deal the final blow, or make the final push to the Islamic Republic. They're saying that basically the United States and the Israelis are in charge of destroying the Iranian Basij, or the Iranian IRGC, or the Iranian military, reducing their capability to confront the protesting crowd. Then the final blow would be pushed and dealt to the Islamic Republic by the people after the Americans and the Israelis just destroy Iran's military capability and even intelligence power. So right now we see that the Iranians are showing willingness and preparedness to engage in a prolonged conflict against the United States and the Israelis.
For as long as it takes. Thank you indeed, Mr. Jalali, for your time and efforts. And as we're reaching the end, I would like to give a very brief final word to every single guest. It's less than 4 minutes. So, Dr. Fatni, we're also hearing the United States President threatening Iran's, let's say, grid or energy grid. Now, if we come to look at it from a legal perspective, isn't this a, let's say, collective punishment?
Yes, it is. Yeah, because collective punishment is a war crime. International law makes it very clear that the energy grid, any infrastructure that is used by civilians, that is essential to civilians, should not be harmed, should not be destroyed in any way. And if it is, then it is considered a war crime. It's in that context that whether it is the US, Israel, Iran, anyone who, and when I talk about anyone, I'm talking really mostly about belligerent states. Belligerent states are under the obligation, according to humanitarian law, which is the laws of war, are under the obligation to make sure that any infrastructure that is so essential to civilian has to be protected. And that's why, for instance, when we really refer to the United States, you just look at the statements when the United States, when, for instance, Russia attacked the energy grid of the Ukraine. What did the United States say? The United States condemned Russia. And it's in that context, you cannot really condemn Russia on one side and say what they have done was a war crime. But in the meantime, you say, well, I can do it. You see, doesn't really make sense. You see, it doesn't really make sense. And that's why the problem that we really have, and that's why we all people who really believe in the rule of law, if the United States of America does not really uphold the rule of law, then who else really? Who else? This is the United States of America. What differentiates the United States, let's say, from Russia, from China, from any other country? Really? I mean, Russia has nuclear weapons. China has nuclear weapons. Russia has economy. China has economy. The only thing that the United States has that makes the US totally different from the other power is respect for the rule of law. And if the United States just does not pay attention to the rule of law, what is really left of the United States? Really nothing. Nothing. It's in that context that the United States is really basically destroying the most essential value that it has, that really differentiated the United States from any other country. And that's why what President Trump is doing is basically destroying what this country really stands for. And that is basically the rule of law that is so essential to the fabric of this nation.
Thank you indeed. Thank you. I have to wrap up. Unfortunately, I can't give more time to other guests to say something at the end. Unfortunately, I thank all my panels for their time and efforts and their insightful analysis. Thank you, Dr. Abdenour Toumi, for being with us here tonight. Dr. Yvonne Ridley, thank you indeed for all your time and efforts. Mr. Jalali from Tehran, thank you for staying this late hour and enlighten us with your analysis. Mr. Mohammed Chris Sassi, thank you as well. And Dr. Fatni, thank you for your time and efforts. And there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. We have reached the end of this coverage, and more are to come in the coming days. Until next time, have a good one.